The morning air at Blue Harbor Marina was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and damp wood. The gentle lapping of the water against the dock created a soothing rhythm, one that longtime fishermen had come to recognize as a sign of a peaceful day ahead. Seagulls glided low over the boats, searching for scraps from the early risers. For Hannah Carter, mornings like these had always been her favorite. At 23 years old, she had spent her entire life by the water, learning the trade from her father, Jack Carter, a man of few words, but infinite wisdom. To the world, he was just a humble fisherman, a weathered man in an old flannel shirt, always tying knots and mending nets. But Hannah knew better. Behind that quiet demeanor lay the instincts of a retired Navy SEAL, a man who had seen more than he ever cared to share. She stood at the end of the dock, pulling a thick rope through her hands, coiling it neatly. Another long day of charter fishing tours lay ahead. Her father had gone out early with a small group of clients, leaving her to prep for the afternoon bookings. It was supposed to be an easy morning. Then she heard it, a low rumble, faint at first, but growing louder, the kind of sound that didn't belong in a place like Blue Harbor. Motorcycles, 5 of them. They came roaring down the gravel road leading to the marina, kicking up dust as they pulled into the lot. Big, loud, and covered in leather, they moved, like a pack of wolves, their presence impossible to ignore. The steel serpents. Hannah had heard of them before. Everyone in town had. They weren't just some weekend motorcycle club. They were trouble. A notorious biker gang that controlled the highways in and out of the county, known for running drugs, extortion, and intimidation. They had never come this far into Blue Harbor before. Until now. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and cold, calculating eyes, was the first to dismount. He removed his helmet slowly, a smirk forming as he glanced around. Duke Thompson. The name sent a chill down Hannah's spine. She tightened her grip on the rope in her hands, forcing herself to remain calm. She had dealt with difficult customers. Before, rowdy tourists, drunk fishermen. But this was different. These men weren't here for a fishing trip. Duke took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against the wooden planks. The other bikers followed, forming a loose half-circle around her. Well, he said, his voice smooth but laced with amusement. Looks like we found ourselves a pretty little mermaid. His men chuckled, their laughter low and menacing. Hannah kept her posture straight, her heart pounding but her face unreadable. She had learned from her father that showing fear only gave bullies more power. This is private property, she said firmly. Unless you've got a charter booked, I suggest you turn around. Duke let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Oh, sweetheart, I think you misunderstand. We go where we want. And today, we like it here. Hannah's stomach tightened. This wasn't just some random stop. They had come here for a reason. Inside the marina's small office, Mike Henderson, the marina's longtime manager and a family friend, watched from the window, his hand already reaching for the phone. He had known Jack Carter long enough to know one thing. If trouble was brewing, Jack needed to know. Out on the water, miles from shore, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He reeled in his fishing line slowly, his eyes narrowing as he heard the urgency in Mike's voice. Jack, Mike whispered, you need to get back here now. Jack didn't ask questions. He simply set down his rod, turned the boat around, and headed back to shore. Because if the steel serpents were circling his daughter, then those men were about to learn a very hard lesson. If you were in Hannah's shoes, what would you do? Would you face them head-on, call for help, or try to de-escalate? Comment below, option 1, 2, or a mix of both. And if you don't want to miss what happens next, like, share, and subscribe. Hannah Carter kept her stance firm, standing her ground as Duke Thompson and his men loomed closer. The heat of the morning sun suddenly felt suffocating, but she forced herself to remain steady, her fingers tightening around the coiled rope in her hands. The steel serpents weren't just passing through. She could tell by the way they spread out, moving with practiced ease, like predators claiming new territory. Duke took another slow step toward her, the weight of his presence settling over the dock like a storm cloud. His leather cut, worn and frayed at the edges, bore the emblem of a coiled serpent, the mark of his gang's reign of terror across 3 states. "You got a lot of nerve talking to me like that, sweetheart," he said, his smirk deepening. The bikers behind him chuckled, their voices thick with amusement. Hannah's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had seen her father handle men like this before, not with panic, but with control. "This is a family-owned marina," she said, her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. "We don't want any trouble." Duke tilted his head, acting as if he were considering her words before letting out a low chuckle. "Trouble?" he repeated, turning to his men. "You boys hear that? She thinks we're here for trouble." Another round of gravelly laughter filled the air, sending a wave of unease through Hannah's chest. She didn't dare turn her head, but out of the corner of her eye, she could see Mike Henderson watching from inside the marina's small office, his old hands gripping the phone receiver tightly. Good. At least someone else knew what was happening. Duke sighed dramatically, shaking his head, as if this whole encounter was just an inconvenience to him. "I tell you what, sweetheart," he said, taking another slow step forward. "We've been looking for a new clubhouse somewhere nice and quiet, a place where no one asks questions. And wouldn't you know it, this little marina of yours, it's perfect." Hannah felt her stomach drop. There it was. They weren't just here to cause trouble. They wanted control. "You want to take over this place?" she asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. Duke gave her a lazy smile, tucking his thumbs into his belt. "Think of it like a business opportunity. We move in, run things our way. You keep working here. Keep it looking all nice for us. We'll even let your daddy keep fishing." He paused, the smile fading slightly. "Long as he knows who's really in charge." Hannah felt her pulse hammer against her ribs, but she held her ground. "This is private property," she repeated, enunciating each word clearly. "You don't own it." Duke sighed again, shaking his head. "You keep saying that, like it matters." Then, without warning, he reached out and yanked the coiled rope from her hands. The force made her stumble back slightly, but she caught herself. The bikers howled with laughter. Duke ran a rough hand along the thick rope, examining it like some kind of prize. "Nice knots," he said, turning it over. "Daddy teach you that?" Hannah's chest burned, but she refused to look away. Duke's grin widened. "Bet he's real proud of his little girl, huh?" His words dripped with mockery, and the sound of boots crunching against gravel told her that the other bikers were closing in. She was outnumbered, alone, and her father was still out on the water. But before Duke could say anything else, a voice cut through the thick air like a blade. "That's enough." The laughter died instantly. Hannah turned just enough to see Mike Henderson standing at the marina's entrance. The old fisherman, who had worked at this dock longer than most people in town had been alive, was no fighter. But the look in his weathered blue eyes carried something unmistakable. Resolve. Duke turned, his expression shifting from amusement to mild irritation. "Well, if it ain't the gatekeeper," he mused, tossing the rope aside like it was worthless. "You got something to say, old man?" Mike didn't flinch. "This marina belongs to the Carter family," he said, his voice steady. "Ain't yours to take." Duke studied him for a moment before chuckling lowly. "You got a lot of guts, Pops, more than I'd expect from a washed-up deckhand." He stepped forward, but Mike didn't back down. A tense silence stretched between them. Then slowly, deliberately, Mike lifted the phone in his hand. "I already called him," he said. "Jack's on his way." Hannah's heart leaped in her chest. Duke's smile froze. For the first time since stepping onto that dock, he hesitated. "You called Carter?" he asked, his voice quieter, but laced with something new. Not fear, but uncertainty. Everyone in this town knew Jack Carter's reputation, even the Steel Serpents. Duke's hesitation lasted only a second before he scoffed, shaking off whatever thought had entered his head. "That right?" he mused, cracking his knuckles. "Guess we'll just have to give him a warm welcome." The other bikers grinned. Hannah swallowed hard. Her father was coming. But would he get here in time? If you were in Hannah's position, what would you do? Stand your ground or try to escape? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget, like, share and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The open water had always given Jack Carter a sense of peace. The slow rock of the boat, the crisp morning air, the rhythmic hum of the motor. It was a world away from the chaos he had once known. He had spent 15 years as a Navy SEAL, but now his battles were against the elements, not enemies. At least, that's what he had hoped. As he stood at the stern of his charter boat, the blue horizon, his clients, a father and son on their first fishing trip, were eagerly reeling in their lines. Jack offered a quiet nod of encouragement, but his attention was elsewhere. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Jack rarely answered calls when he was out on the water. But when he saw Mike Henderson's name, something in his gut tightened. Mike wasn't the type to bother him unless it was serious. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Jack." Mike's voice was low, urgent. "You need to get back here now." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. "What's going on?" "It's them," Mike said. "Steel Serpents, 5 of them. They're circling Hannah at the dock." Jack's heart slowed, his mind shifting into something automatic, something primal. The old instincts came back like a flood. Assess, plan, act. "I'm on my way," he said, already turning toward the helm. He kept his voice calm, even as the muscles in his arms coiled, the old tension creeping into his body. Jack turned to his clients, his expression unreadable. "Folks," he said, "I'm sorry, but we're cutting this trip short. Something's come up." The father, still holding his fishing rod, looked confused but didn't argue when he saw the hard steel in Jack's gaze. Jack didn't wait for a response. He fired up the engine, pushing the boat toward shore at a speed that cut through the waves like a knife. His mind was already calculating. They sent 5 men. Why only 5? A gang like the Steel Serpents didn't operate in small numbers unless they were scouting, which meant this wasn't just about harassing Hannah. They want something. Jack's jaw tightened, and they just made a big mistake. Duke Thompson leaned against the wooden railing of the dock, his smirk never fading. He turned his head slightly, looking at Hannah, then back at Mike. "Guess Daddy's coming home," he mused. One of the bikers chuckled, kicking at a loose board on the dock. "Man's just a fisherman. Bet he don't even know what's waiting for him." Mike let out a quiet breath. They didn't know. They had no idea who Jack Carter really was. Hannah, still standing firm despite the tension, refused to look at Duke. But inside, she was counting the seconds. Then, from across the water, the distant hum of a boat engine grew, louder. Duke turned, watching as a vessel cut through the mist, approaching faster than any fishing boat should. Mike's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. There he is. The blue horizon pulled into the dock, the engine cutting off in a single, precise motion. Jack Carter stepped off, his boots hitting the wooden planks with a solid, deliberate weight. The biker stiffened slightly. Jack didn't look like much. Worn jeans, an old flannel shirt, a navy cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked like any other fisherman on the coast, ordinary. But something about the way he moved, the calculated stillness, the way his eyes swept the scene in one smooth scan, sent a ripple of unease through the group. Duke, however, didn't flinch. "Now there's a face I've been waiting to see," he said, stepping forward. "Jack Carter." Jack's eyes met his. "Duke Thompson." His voice was calm, measured. Duke spread his arms slightly, playing to the audience. Heard a lot about you, old man. Town legend, ain't you? Jack didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted to Hannah, scanning for signs of distress. She held herself together, but he saw the way her fingers curled into fists. Jack turned back to Duke, his expression unreadable. "I heard you've been making yourself at home," Jack said. Duke smirked. "Yeah. Figured it's about time this. Marina had some real leadership." Jack's brow lifted slightly, but his face remained passive. Duke's grin widened. "Tell you what, Jack. You hand over the keys, let us run things our way, and we'll let you keep fishing. Maybe even let the girls stick around." Mike tensed. Hannah's knuckles turned white. Jack's response was quiet, almost casual. "You talk too much." Duke's smile wavered for half a second, then without warning, Jack took a step forward. Not fast, not aggressive, but just enough to make Duke react. Duke shifted his weight, his shoulders tensing before he caught himself. Jack had seen it 1,000 times before. The moment a man second-guesses his own confidence, he was in Duke's head now. The rest of the bikers picked up on it too. The laughter, the arrogance, it had dulled just a little. Jack glanced at the rope Duke had thrown aside. He bent down, picked it up, and began coiling it slowly, his hands moving with steady, practiced ease. He didn't look at Duke when he spoke. "You like to think you're the strongest man in the room," Jack said. "That's the only way men like you survive. You intimidate people, push them around, make them afraid." Duke's jaw tightened. "I don't need a lecture, old man." Jack continued, unbothered. "Problem is, you picked the wrong place, and the wrong people." Duke's eyes flicked toward his men, as if measuring how much control he still had. Jack tied off the rope and straightened to his full height. "I'll give you one chance," he said, his voice low, firm. "Turn around, ride out, and don't come back." For the first time, Duke's smirk faltered. The bikers behind him exchanged glances. Jack didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats. But something about the way he stood there, completely calm, completely certain, made it clear. If this turned into a fight, Duke wasn't going to win. The air crackled with tension. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Duke's fingers twitched at his side, his body screaming for a response. Then, slowly, he tilted his head. "Tell you what, old man," he murmured. "Let's see just how tough you really are." With a quick nod, his men stepped forward. Hannah's heart pounded. But Jack just sighed. They never learn. What do you think Jack should do next? Should he fight or wait for them to make the first move? Comment below, and don't forget, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. A tense silence settled over the marina. The morning sun hung lower now, casting long shadows across the wooden dock. The air was thick, not just with heat, but with the weight of what was about to happen. Jack Carter remained perfectly still, his face unreadable. He had seen this moment play out 1,000 times before, in training, in war zones, in places where men didn't walk away from their mistakes. But these weren't soldiers, they were bullies, and Jack had spent a lifetime dealing with men like them. Duke Thompson's lips curled into a sneer, his body shifting as his ego fought against the warning signs flashing in his head. His gang was watching, and he couldn't afford to look weak. "You know," Duke said, voice mocking, "I don't like being told what to do, especially not by some washed-up old fisherman." Jack didn't react. Duke turned his head slightly. Tank, a massive biker, stepped forward, easily 6'4", over 250 pounds of solid muscle. His fists were scarred, his knuckles tattooed with faded letters spelling "No Mercy." Tank rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck. "How about I teach Captain America? Hear a little lesson in respect?" Duke grinned, stepping back to give Tank room. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Jack simply exhaled. Tank lunged, a wrecking ball of a man, built to intimidate, built to crush anything in his way. He moved like a freight train, fast and brutal, his fist swinging toward Jack's ribs with full force. Jack stepped aside, not dodging, just shifting enough to make Tank miss by inches. Tank's own momentum betrayed him, sending him stumbling forward. Jack didn't waste time. One strike, controlled, precise. His elbow slammed into the side of Tank's head, sending the giant crumpling onto one knee. The whole gang froze. Duke's smirk faltered. Tank, stunned, shook his head and roared, launching forward again, this time with both hands reaching for Jack's throat. Jack sidestepped once more, grabbing Tank's wrist mid-motion. A twist, a pull, a shift of weight, and suddenly the biker's own force sent him flying forward, his knees smashed against the dock. Jack didn't even look at him. He was already turning back to Duke. Next, Jack's voice was calm, quiet. The rest of the gang hesitated. Mike Henderson let out a low whistle, barely hiding his smirk. Tank, still groggy, gritted his teeth in frustration. He had never lost a fight like this. Not ever. Duke scowled. "Don't just sit there, you idiot. Get up." Tank pushed himself upright, fury blazing in his eyes. Jack sighed. Men like this never learned the easy way. This time, Tank didn't charge. Blindly, he moved in slower, more controlled, like a wounded predator recalibrating. Jack watched him, hands still relaxed at his sides, waiting. Hannah wanted to say something, to warn her father, to tell him to stop, but she knew better. He had everything under control. Tank lunged again, this time faking left before swinging his right fist toward Jack's head. Jack ducked, one sharp jab to the throat, not enough to cripple but enough to send Tank gasping for air, stumbling back. Jack let him fall. This time he wouldn't get back up. Duke's face had gone stone cold. The other bikers shifted uneasily. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were supposed to be in control. Duke's hand drifted toward his belt. Jack saw it immediately, the shift in posture. The micro-movements of a man getting ready to escalate. A heartbeat later, Duke pulled a knife. The blade flashed in the morning sun, and the whole world seemed to slow. Hannah gasped. Mike took an instinctive step forward. Jack, he simply watched. Duke flipped the knife in his hand, adjusting his grip. "Old man, I've gutted tougher guys than you." Jack tilted his head slightly. "That so?" Duke grinned. "Yeah. And you? You're about to be just another name on the list." The gang snickered, their confidence returning now that steel was in play. Duke lunged, fast, reckless, overconfident. Jack didn't move until the last second. Then, fluid, effortless, instinctive, he sidestepped, grabbing Duke's wrist in midair. A twist, a snap, a shift of weight, and just like that the knife was gone. The blade tumbled to the dock with a clatter. Duke stumbled forward, momentarily stunned, his own hand now pinned in Jack's iron grip. Jack's voice was calm, measured. "You made 3 mistakes." Duke struggled, but Jack's grip tightened. "First," Jack continued, "you brought a knife to a fight you were already losing." Duke snarled, trying to yank his arm free. Jack wrenched it harder. "Second," Jack said, "you thought using a weapon would make you the dangerous one." Duke grunted, his knees buckling slightly. Jack leaned in close. "And third," he murmured, "you thought I wouldn't see it coming." With a final twist, Jack forced Duke's own weight against him, sending the biker boss crashing onto the dock. A stunned silence. The other bikers froze. Jack stepped back, unshaken, untouchable. Duke groaned, clutching his wrist, rage and humiliation flashing in his eyes. Jack calmly picked up the fallen knife, flipping it once before tossing it into the water. A splash. Gone. Jack turned back to Duke, adjusting his sleeves. "You want to try that again?" The gang stood motionless, no longer cocky, no longer laughing. Duke pushed himself up slowly, his chest heaving. His hand trembled where Jack had twisted it. He had never been manhandled like that before, and worse, his men had seen it. Jack waited, letting the humiliation settle in. Hannah's heartbeat slowed, realizing, for the first time, that this wasn't just a fight. This was a lesson. And Duke had just learned it the hard way. Jack dusted off his hands and turned away, as if he had already won, but Duke wasn't done. His voice was low, seething. "You're dead, Carter." Jack paused. Duke's breathing was ragged, his teeth clenched. "This ain't over," Duke spat. "You hear me, old man? You're dead. Your girl's dead. This whole marina, it's ours." Jack's jaw tightened slightly, and just like that, the game had changed. He turned back, his calm blue eyes turning to ice. "That," he said softly, "was your last mistake." What should Jack do next? Should he warn Duke, or show him why messing with his family was the biggest mistake of his life? Comment below, and don't forget, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The silence after. Jack's final words hung heavy in the air. The steel serpent stood motionless, absorbing what had just happened. Duke Thompson, their leader, lay sprawled on the dock, his wrist twisted at an awkward angle from Jack's precise disarm. His knife was gone, his pride bruised, but his rage was still burning. Jack stood calmly, hands relaxed at his sides, as if he had just finished tying a fishing knot, rather than taking down the head of a notorious biker gang. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Duke pushed himself up, gritting his teeth against the pain. His breathing was ragged, his confidence shaken, but his ego refused to accept defeat. He turned to his men, eyes blazing with humiliation and fury. "Well," Duke spat, "you just gonna stand there, or are you gonna put this old man in the dirt?" That was all it took. 3 bikers moved at once. Jack didn't wait. He stepped sideways, fluid, controlled, as the first biker lunged at him. The man was fast but sloppy, his punch aimed wild and reckless. Jack redirected it with a quick parry, using the biker's own momentum to send him stumbling forward. Before the man could recover, Jack drove an elbow into his ribs, a single calculated strike that left him gasping for air. 1 down. The second biker, a lean, wiry man with tattoos running down his arms, came in low, aiming for Jack's legs in an attempt to tackle him. Jack twisted, sidestepping again, and brought his knee up hard into the man's face. The biker crashed to the dock, groaning as blood trickled from his nose. 2 down. The third, seeing his friends taken out so quickly, hesitated. Jack didn't. With a swift movement, he stepped forward and grabbed the man's leather vest, pulling him off balance before driving him face first into a wooden piling. The impact sent a dull thud echoing across the marina. 3 down. The fight had lasted less than 10 seconds. Hannah stared in shock. She had always known her father was tough. She had grown up hearing whispers about his past, knowing that his military service was more than just some desk job. But seeing him move like this, with such precision, such complete control, was something else entirely. It was like watching a ghost move through shadows. The remaining bikers froze, their earlier bravado wavering. Duke, still clutching his wrist, took a step back. He had underestimated Jack Carter. Badly. But Duke had one last play. His hand went to his belt, grabbing a radio. Jack saw it instantly. "You really want to do that?" Jack's voice was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Duke's jaw clenched, his pride fighting against his fear. But the sting of embarrassment, the watching eyes of his men, forced his hand. He pressed the radio button. "Get here now." A moment of silence, then a crackled response. "ETA 5 minutes. Hannah's blood ran cold. Duke grinned, his breathing still heavy, but his eyes filled with satisfaction. "You had a good run, old man," he muttered, straightening his vest. "But I hope you got some more tricks up your sleeve, 'cause you just bought yourself a world of trouble." Jack said nothing. He simply rolled his shoulders, shifting his weight. Duke's grin widened. "That's right," he said. "You might be tough, but you ain't gonna take down a whole crew." Jack turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward Hannah. "You okay?" Hannah, still processing everything she had seen, forced herself to nod. "Yeah." Jack nodded once, then, turning back to Duke, he sighed. "You think this is about numbers?" Jack said quietly. "That's your mistake." Duke scoffed. "Yeah? And what's it about then?" Jack glanced down the dock, where Mike Henderson stood just inside the marina office, holding something in his hands. A radio. Jack tilted his head slightly, giving Mike a silent nod. Mike pressed a button. From across the marina, dozens of headlights flicked on, a fleet of trucks. Locals, fishermen, veterans, men who knew what the Steel Serpents were trying to do, had been waiting. They weren't carrying weapons. They didn't need to. They had numbers of their own. Duke's cocky smirk disappeared. The bikers who had remained standing suddenly shifted, uneasily, realizing they weren't the only ones with backup. Hannah watched as realization dawned on Duke's face. Jack let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "You ride into small towns, thinking you can take whatever you want," Jack said. "You expect people to be afraid, to roll over." Duke's fingers twitched, but he didn't move. Jack took a slow step forward, his voice steady, even. "But this isn't your highway, and these people, they aren't afraid of you." The truck engines rumbled in the distance. Jack gestured slightly toward Duke's men. "Your boys still feel like sticking around." The gang exchanged glances. One of them, a man with gray streaks in his beard, a little older than the rest, stepped forward. He had been watching everything, and now he had seen enough. "Nah," the older biker muttered, shaking his head. He turned to Duke. "This ain't worth it." Duke whipped his head toward him. "What the hell does that mean?" The biker removed his cut, tossing it to the dock. "Means I'm out." Duke's rage twisted his face, but he couldn't do anything. The others saw it too, one by one. They started backing away. Hannah could hardly believe it. Her father hadn't just fought them, he had broken them without throwing another punch. Duke stood alone now, his men walking away, his backup still minutes out. But it didn't matter. There was nothing left to fight for. Jack watched him carefully. Duke clenched his fists, his whole body trembling. But he wasn't stupid. Jack wasn't just some fisherman. He wasn't even just a Navy SEAL. He was a man who knew exactly who he was. And that made him more dangerous than anything Duke had ever faced. Jack took one step closer, his voice low. "This is over," he said. Duke's breath was ragged, his shoulders tight, his hands shaking. But he didn't move. Jack lifted his chin slightly. "Get on your bike," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Duke's fingers flexed, twitching toward his belt, but he stopped himself. Jack just stared, waiting. Duke hesitated. Then, finally, reluctantly, he turned. He staggered to his bike, gripping the handlebars so tight his knuckles went white. One by one, the remaining serpents followed. They mounted their motorcycles, engines roared to life. Duke threw one last hateful glare at Jack. Then he revved the throttle and peeled out of the lot. Jack watched them go, his face unreadable. Hannah finally let out the breath she had been holding. Jack turned to her. "You okay?" She let out a short laugh, half disbelief, half admiration. "I don't think I even know what okay is anymore." Jack gave her a small nod. "Come on," he said. "Let's clean up." What do you think? Was Jack right to let them walk away, or should he have finished it another way? Comment below, and don't forget, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens. Next, a turning point. From conflict to change. The dust had barely settled on the dock when Jack Carter finally spoke again. His voice was calm, steady, but carried a weight that cut deeper than any threat ever could. "This is the part where you walk away," Jack said, his gaze locked onto Duke Thompson, the last man still standing from the steel serpents. The rest of the gang had already started to back off, some hesitating, others outright removing their cuts. But Duke wasn't done. His jaw clenched, his body tense with the kind of rage that only came from realizing you weren't the biggest threat in the room anymore. But even in his anger, Duke wasn't stupid. He had seen Jack's movements, controlled, efficient, deadly, and deep down, whether he wanted to admit it or not, he knew he couldn't win. The only question was, what would he do with that realization? The first signs of doubt, a rough voice broke the silence. "Boss." It was Tank, the massive biker who had tried and failed to take Jack down earlier. He was still catching his breath, rubbing his ribs where Jack's elbow had knocked the wind out of him. But now he wasn't looking at Jack. He was looking at Duke. Duke shot him a glare. "What?" Tank hesitated. He was loyal. Had always been loyal, but now he wasn't so sure. "That guy," Tank finally said, jerking his head toward Jack. He's trained. This ain't some bar fight, Duke. This is something else." Duke's expression darkened, but Tank wasn't the only one who had noticed. Another biker, Marcus, stepped forward, rubbing at his wrist. The same wrist Jack had nearly snapped in half just minutes ago. "He moves like a soldier," Marcus muttered, half to himself, half to the group. Jack tilted his head slightly, his blue eyes scanning them carefully. "You were Army, weren't you?" he said, his voice quiet but sure. Marcus froze. So did Tank. Jack nodded slowly. "I can tell." Tank's brow furrowed. "How the hell would you know that?" Jack took a step forward, his movements still measured, controlled. "Because I've seen men like you before," he said. "I've served with them. I've fought beside them." Marcus's expression hardened, but there was something new in his eyes now. Recognition. Jack didn't just know how to fight. He understood them. Because he had been one of them. Tank's gaze narrowed. "Who are you?" Jack exhaled. For a long time he had left his past where it belonged, in the past. But these men needed to hear it. They needed to understand. "I spent 15 years in the Navy," Jack said. "SEAL Team 6. The words hung, heavy in the air. Silence. Complete, utter silence. Then Marcus let out a low curse under his breath. Jesus Christ. Even Duke's posture shifted, though he was trying hard to mask it. Jack watched their faces, their reactions, their understanding. Because now they knew. They knew that everything they had just witnessed, every effortless movement, every takedown, every calculated strike wasn't luck. It was training. It was experience. It was lethal precision honed over decades of war, and suddenly, the whole dynamic shifted. The moment of choice, Tank's fingers flexed at his sides. He had seen combat. But this was different. Jack wasn't just another tough guy. He was the real deal. The kind of man who didn't just win fights, he ended them before they even started. And for the first time in years, Tank felt like he was on the wrong side of something. Marcus looked at the rest of the gang, seeing the same doubt in their faces. Then he turned back to Duke. "You didn't tell us we were going up against a damn SEAL, Duke," he said. Duke's fists tightened, his entire body coiled with frustration. "What does it matter?" Duke spat. "He's just one guy." Marcus shook his head. "That one guy just took out half our crew without breaking a sweat." "Yeah," Duke snapped. "And what, you scared?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he just exhaled. Then, slowly, he reached up and removed his cut, a symbol of loyalty, a symbol of the steel serpents, and he dropped it to the ground. A beat passed. Then, Tank did the same, then another, and another. One by one, the gang began removing their cuts, letting them fall to the dock like discarded rags. Duke's face twisted with fury. "You cowards," he seethed. But Jack shook his head. "They're not cowards," he said. "They're just finally seeing clearly." Duke's breathing was heavy now, his mind racing. Everything he had built, everything he had claimed, was slipping through his fingers, and Jack saw it. He saw the desperation in Duke's eyes, the kind of desperation that made men do stupid things. So, Jack gave him one last chance. "Let it go," Jack said, his voice firm. "Walk away." Duke's jaw ticked. He knew he should, but his pride wouldn't let him. Instead, he reached for the gun in his waistband. Hannah gasped. Tank and Marcus moved, but they weren't fast enough. Jack was. Before Duke could even pull the weapon free, Jack closed the distance between them. One motion, one strike, a single, precise hit to Duke's wrist. The gun clattered to the dock. Jack didn't stop moving. He grabbed Duke by the collar and, with no more effort than tossing a fishing net, spun him and slammed him onto the dock. Duke let out a pained grunt, his face pressed against the wood, his arms pinned. Jack crouched down next to him. "You just don't listen, do you?" Jack said, his voice low, almost disappointed. Duke struggled, but Jack's grip was like iron. The sound of sirens filled the air. The cops were here, and Duke was done. Jack let out a slow breath, finally releasing his hold. Duke didn't move, because he knew. He had lost. The beginning of something new. The remaining gang members, the ones who had removed their cuts, the ones who had made a choice, stood watching in silence. Jack slowly turned to them. "You want a second chance?" Jack asked. Marcus and Tank exchanged glances. Then, after a moment, Tank nodded. Jack gave a slight nod back. Because today, this wasn't about destroying men, it was about saving them. And for the first time in a long time, some of them were finally ready to be saved. What do you think? Should Jack have let Duke walk, or was this the only way it could have ended? Comment below, and don't forget, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Community rises, support, and transformation. The wail of police sirens grew louder, cutting through the tense morning air. The fight was over. Duke Thompson lay motionless on the dock, face down, defeated, the weight of his own failures pressing into his spine. The steel serpents, once a force of intimidation, stood silent, their numbers dwindling, not by force, but by choice. And Jack Carter? He simply stood there, watching, not as a man who had won a fight, but as a man who had changed one. The town stands up. The first to step forward was Mike Henderson. The old marina worker had watched the entire confrontation unfold, his weathered hands still clutching the radio he had used to summon help. But as he stepped onto the dock, his grip loosened, because he realized Jack Carter didn't need backup. Jack had done what no one else in town had dared to do, stood up to men who had taken whatever they wanted for years. Mike wasn't the only one watching. More figures emerged from the parking lot and nearby buildings. Fishermen, boat mechanics, shop owners, people who had been afraid for too long, and now they weren't afraid anymore. "Mr. Carter," Mike said, his voice carrying over the dock, "I reckon it's about time this town stops looking the other way." Jack turned slightly, his expression unreadable, but Hannah saw the shift. Weight lifting. A moment of quiet acknowledgement between men who had spent their lives standing between order and chaos. Jack gave a slight nod. "Reckon you're right." Hannah finds her voice. Hannah had spent her entire life at this marina, learning the rhythms of the tides, the language of the sea. But now, for the first time, she realized the dock wasn't just a place for boats and fishing lines. It was a home, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from them. She stepped forward, past her father, past the bodies of fallen men, until she stood face to face with Tank and Marcus, the two bikers who had just thrown away their colors. She could see the shame in their eyes, the silent war between their past and what they wanted to be, and she knew the feeling. For so long she had seen herself as just Jack Carter's daughter. But now she had a voice of her own. "You have a choice," Hannah said, her voice steady, clear. Tank lifted his head slightly. Hannah pointed at Duke, still groaning on the dock. "You can follow him, or you can do something different." Silence. Tank's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "We didn't know," Marcus muttered, rubbing at his wrist where Jack had wrenched it earlier. We thought we were just keeping order." "Order?" Hannah's eyes narrowed. "You weren't keeping order, you were making people afraid." Marcus flinched. Hannah exhaled slowly, forcing herself to steady her breath. But fear only works until someone stands up to it. She let the words sink in, her gaze never wavering. Then she took another step closer. "You said you were soldiers," she said, her voice softer now, less accusing, more understanding. "So act like it." Tank's massive hands curled into fists, but not in anger, in frustration, in conflict. He glanced down at the cut at his feet, the emblem of the steel serpent staring back at him like a ghost of everything he had become. He thought about the things he had done, the people he had hurt, the choices that had led him here, and for the first time in years he wanted to be something else, something better. Finally, after a long, agonizing pause, he looked at Jack. "What do we do now?" Jack didn't answer right away, because he knew. This wasn't his choice to make, this was theirs. He simply gestured toward the dock. "You start by cleaning up your mess." Marcus makes his choice. Duke let out a low groan, finally finding the strength to lift his head. His body was battered, his wrist bruised, his pride in shambles, and now he was about to lose more than just the fight. Marcus stood over him, his expression uncertain, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Duke locked eyes with him. "Marcus," Duke hissed, his voice thick with venom. "You ain't thinking about walking away, are you?" Marcus hesitated, because for years Duke had been more than just a boss. He had been a brother, a leader. But now he just looked like a man who had lost everything. Jack watched, saying nothing, because this was the moment. Marcus could turn back, or he could step forward. His lips parted, the words barely above a whisper. "I already walked away." Duke's face twisted in fury. "Then you're nothing." Marcus didn't react, because, for the first time in a long time, he didn't need Duke's approval. Instead, he simply turned, took a deep breath, and joined Tank. Duke was alone. The community stands together. The police finally arrived, stepping onto the scene with cautious glances at the scattered gang members, the bruised faces, the silent tension still crackling in the air. Sheriff Tom Weston, a man who had dealt with bikers before but never seen anything like this, stepped forward, hands on his belt. "Gonna be a long night of paperwork," he muttered, surveying the scene. Jack met his gaze. "Reckon so." The sheriff turned toward Tank and Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What about them?" Jack let the question hang in the air before finally speaking. "They're staying." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. Marcus and Tank shifted uneasily. "But," Jackie wasn't finished, "they're gonna help fix what they broke." Tank looked at the wreckage around him, the knocked-over crates, the busted railing, the scuff marks from Duke's last stand. Then, without hesitation, he bent down and started picking up debris. Marcus followed, and then, one by one, so did the others. The people of Blue Harbor Marina, the ones who had once been too afraid to stand up, now saw men who had spent their lives destroying things, finally learning to build something instead. And just like that, something shifted. This wasn't just about a fight anymore. This was about something bigger, about second chances, about redemption, about proving that it's never too late to choose a different path. And as Hannah watched her father, the quiet fisherman who had taught her that real strength had nothing to do with muscle or weapons, but everything to do with standing for what's right, she realized. She had never been prouder to be his daughter. Do you think people like Marcus and Tank deserve second chances? Would you let them stay or send them packing? Comment below. And don't forget, like, share and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The final stand. Duke's last attempt. The air had shifted. The fight was over, or at least it should have been. The steel serpents were broken, their loyalty shattered. Some had taken off their cuts, stepping away from the gang life. Others had followed Tank and Marcus's lead, choosing to stay and make things right. But one man hadn't moved. Duke Thompson. He was still on the dock, hunched over, his breathing ragged, his pride lying in pieces around him. The weight of defeat sat heavy on his shoulders, but he wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. He had spent too many years being feared, too many years being the one who gave the orders. And now his men had abandoned him. Now his power was gone, and it was because of them, because of Jack Carter. Because of his damned daughter. And that was when Duke made the worst mistake of his life. Duke's final play, a low, bitter laugh, slipped from Duke's lips. "Look at you," he rasped, finally pushing himself upright. His wrist was still twisted and bruised, but his eyes were burning. "You think you've won, Carter?" Duke sneered. "You think you can just walk away?" Jack didn't move, didn't answer, because he knew what was coming next. Duke's eyes slid past him, landing on Hannah, who was still standing near Marcus and Tank. His lips curled. That's when Hannah felt it. A slow, twisting knot in her stomach. She saw the shift in his posture, the way his weight shifted forward, the way his hands flexed at his sides. He wasn't looking at her. He was hunting her. And before anyone could react, he moved. The lunge Duke lunged. For Hannah, moving faster than anyone expected. His body was battered, his muscles sore, but his rage carried him forward. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She barely had time to move, barely had time to think, before Jack was there. Between them like a ghost. One moment he had been standing still. The next, Duke was in the air. Jack's hands caught Duke's wrist mid-swing, twisting his entire body in one fluid motion. It was effortless, practiced, surgical. Duke's momentum became his own downfall. His body was flipped, legs swinging up over his head, before he slammed into the dock with a bone-rattling crack. Face first, the whole dock shuddered with the force of it. Hannah gasped, the others stared in shock. Duke let out a painful groan, his body twitching as his hand weakly reached for his belt, but Jack was already there. His boot landed on Duke's wrist, pinning it to the dock. Jack stared down at him, his face calm. "That was your last mistake." Duke gritted his teeth, trying to shift, trying to push up off the wood, but Jack's weight didn't budge. Jack's final warning. "You had a choice," Jack said, voice low, controlled. Duke spat blood onto the dock, his body trembling with fury. "Go to hell!" Jack's jaw tensed. Then, in one smooth motion, he knelt down, pressing Duke's wrist harder against the planks. "You don't scare me," Duke snarled. Jack didn't blink. "I'm not trying to." Duke froze, because there was something in Jack's eyes, something deeper, colder than anything Duke had ever seen. "You think strength is about fear," Jack said. "You think power comes from making people bow to you." Jack leaned in closer. "You've spent your whole life pretending to be the biggest predator in the room." Duke's chest heaved. Jack's voice dropped lower. "But I'm not a fisherman," he said, and that's when Duke understood. That was the moment he finally realized who he had been dealing with. Jack Carter wasn't just a veteran. He wasn't just a fighter. He was something else entirely. Man who didn't need to prove his strength because he already knew it, because he had nothing to prove, only something to protect. And that was what made him truly dangerous. Duke's body went limp, and for the first time in his life, he knew fear. The police arrive. The first squad car pulled up, tires crunching against the gravel. Deputy Martinez was the first out, hand hovering near his gun. What the hell happened here? Jack finally stood, stepping back as two officers rushed forward to grab Duke. Just a misunderstanding, Jack said quietly. Duke let out a sharp grunt as the officers hauled him up, slapping cuffs on his wrists. "You're done, Thompson," Sheriff Weston said as he approached. "It's over." Duke's head lolled to the side, his lips split, his pride in ruins. His gang was gone, his power was gone. All he had left was a long ride to a jail cell. Jack watched as the officers led Duke away. Then he turned, and what he saw nearly knocked the wind out of him. The bikers who chose to change Tank and Marcus stood together watching Duke get hauled off, and then they turned to Jack. Tank cleared his throat. "What now?" Jack studied them for a moment. Then, in a voice calm but firm, he answered, "You start over." Marcus hesitated, and then, after a long moment, he nodded. Jack turned to the sheriff. "These men, they're not done yet." Sheriff Weston lifted a brow. "You saying I shouldn't take them in?" Jack's gaze didn't waver. "They made a mistake," he said, "but they're ready to fix it." Weston studied the bikers. Tank stood tall, his expression resolute. Marcus looked determined, no longer the same man who had followed Duke blindly. Finally, the sheriff exhaled. "I got a veterans program in Portland," Weston said. "It's tough, real work, no shortcuts." Tank straightened. "We'll do it." Marcus nodded. The sheriff sighed. "All right then." He turned to his deputies. "Let 'em go, they're not serpents anymore." The final cut dropped to the ground, and with it, a new beginning. Hannah sees her father in a new light. As the police wrapped up, Hannah walked over to her father. For a long moment she just looked at him, then she shook her head, laughing softly. "I always knew you were tough," she murmured. "But that?" She let out a breath. "That was something else." Jack met her gaze. "Strength isn't about how hard you hit," he said. His eyes drifted over to Marcus and Tank, men who had been given a second chance, men who had taken it. "It's about how you use it." Hannah smiled, and for the first time in a long time, she understood. Her father wasn't just a fisherman, he was a protector. And now, because of him, this town was finally safe. "What do you think? Was Jack right to let them go, or should they have paid for what they did?" Comment below, and don't forget, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The aftermath. Redemption and a new beginning. The dust had settled. The steel serpents were gone, their leader, Duke Thompson, taken away in handcuffs. The gang that once terrorized Blue Harbor Marina had been dismantled, not through bloodshed, but through something far more powerful. A choice. A choice to walk away. A choice to be better. And as the sun rose over the marina, painting the water in golden light, the real work began. A new path for the former bikers. The next morning, a bus arrived at the edge of town. Tank, Marcus, and the other former gang members stood in silence, their old lives a weight on their shoulders. Jack. Carter watched from the dock, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Sheriff Weston stepped up beside him. "You sure about this?" Jack nodded. "They were lost," he said. "But lost doesn't mean gone," the sheriff exhaled. "The program in Portland is no joke. These guys mess up, they're done. They won't mess up." Jack's voice was firm. Tank turned, stepping away from the group. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the man who had changed everything. Then, without a word, he extended his hand. Jack looked at it, then he shook it. "Don't waste this chance," Jack said. Tank nodded, his voice gruff. "We won't." Marcus hesitated before stepping forward. I spent my whole life following the wrong kind of men, he admitted. But you? He exhaled, shaking his head. I've never met anyone like you, Carter. Jack held his gaze. Then don't waste what you learned here, he said simply. Marcus gave a small, determined nod. Then, one by one, the men boarded the bus, and just like that, they were gone. Not as criminals, not as gang members, but as men looking for redemption. The marina finds its purpose. With the steel serpents gone, the town slowly began to heal. But the marina, it became something more than just a place for fishing charters. It became a haven for veterans searching for purpose, for men who had served, fought, and returned to a world that didn't always know what to do with them. Word spread fast. The first veteran arrived within a week, then another and another. Men who had been wandering, looking for somewhere to belong. And Jack gave them a place. He taught them how to fix boats, how to fish, how to work with their hands. But more than that, he taught them how to find peace in the quiet of the water. He taught them how to lead, not with fear, but with integrity. And for the first time, the marina was no longer just a business. It was a brotherhood. Hannah's realization one evening. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Hannah found her father standing at the edge of the dock, watching the boats rock gently in the water. She walked up beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. I always thought your strength was in fighting, she admitted. Jack turned slightly, his brow lifting. But now I know, she continued, her voice softer. Your real strength, it's in leading people to something better. Jack let out a slow breath, his gaze still fixed on the water. Fighting's easy, he said. Winning a fight? That's simple. He turned, looking at her. But real strength? He gestured toward the marina. Real strength is knowing when to fight and when to build. Hannah nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. She had spent so much time watching her father fight battles, but this was his greatest victory, not breaking men down, but lifting them up. The final message. Few weeks later, a letter arrived from Tank. Hannah read over Jack's shoulder as he opened it. Mr. Carter, we've finished our first month in the program. It's tough, but it's the right kind of tough. We work hard, real hard. But for the first time in years, it feels like the work means something. Marcus started leading some of the newer guys. You wouldn't believe it, but he's actually good at it. We've got a long road ahead, but I wanted you to know something. You didn't just stop us that day. You saved us. I won't waste what you gave me. Thank you. Tank Jack folded the letter, setting it on the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because the lesson had been learned. Strength wasn't about how hard you hit. It was about how you lifted others up. A call to action. Hannah turned to Jack, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You know, she said, this story needs to be told. Jack arched a brow. Oh yeah? She nodded. People need to know that it's never too late, she said. That second chances are real. Jack considered, her words then exhaled. If it helps someone, he said, then it's worth telling. Hannah turned to the camera, her voice steady. If you believe in second chances, share this story, she said. And as the screen faded to black, the message remained. Because some stories don't end with a fight. Some stories end with redemption, and that was the real victory. Do you believe in second chances? Would you have given them the same opportunity? Comment below, and don't forget, like, share and subscribe to hear more stories like this.